March 23, 1945. OKW headquarters, somewhere in Germany. An intelligence officer places a report on the desk. American forces crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim last night. No artillery preparation, no air support, no warning. Just assault boats in darkness. The officer reading the report stops. Oppenheim wasn't even considered a likely crossing site. Montgomery's massive operation is scheduled for tonight with 1 million troops. But Patton, always Patton, has beaten everyone across with a division that wasn't supposed to attack for days. The German High Command had calculated that the Rhine would buy weeks, maybe months. They had plans for every contingency, defensive positions prepared, reserves positioned to counterattack. But none of that matters now. Because Patton crossed overnight, and the realization spreading through German command is unavoidable. If Patton can do this, nothing can stop the Americans. The war is over. They just don't want to admit it yet. For 2,000 years, the Rhine had been Germania's western boundary. Roman legions had struggled to cross it. Medieval armies had fought for control of its bridges. In March 1945, it represented Germany's last natural defensive barrier before the heartland. German military planners calculated that defending the Rhine could delay the Allied advance for months, time desperately needed to organize defenses in depth or negotiate from a position that wasn't complete collapse. The defensive preparations reflected this strategic importance. Wehrmacht engineers had demolished every bridge across the Rhine that German forces didn't absolutely need. Artillery positions covered likely crossing sites. Infantry divisions, though depleted from months of fighting, held defensive positions along the western bank. Intelligence officers monitored Allied movements, trying to predict where major crossing attempts would occur. Montgomery's Operation Plunder dominated German planning assessments. The British Field Marshal's methodical approach to operations meant his intentions were often telegraphed weeks in advance. By mid-March, German intelligence knew Montgomery was preparing a massive assault across the Rhine near Wesel. The scale of preparation was impossible to conceal. Stockpiling of bridging equipment, concentration of artillery, movement of airborne divisions to forward airfields. German commanders positioned their best remaining units to oppose this crossing, calculating that if they could inflict heavy casualties on Montgomery's operation, it might delay subsequent Allied advances long enough to matter strategically. The assessment of American crossing sites was more complex. First Army had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th, creating a bridgehead that German forces had failed to eliminate despite repeated counterattacks. That bridgehead worried German planners because it positioned American forces to drive toward the Ruhr. But Remagen was far enough north that Third Army's crossing sites would likely be elsewhere. German intelligence correctly identified Mainz as Third Army's most logical crossing point. The city sat at the confluence of the Rhine and Main rivers, served as a major rail hub, and offered good approaches from the west. Accordingly, German defenders concentrated forces around Mainz and prepared defensive positions to oppose any crossing attempt there. What they didn't adequately prepare for was Patton's willingness to accept the operational complexity of crossing both the Main and Rhine in exchange for achieving surprise somewhere other than the obvious location. On March 22nd, when reports reached OKW that Third Army elements had crossed at Oppenheim, 10 miles south of Mainz, the initial reaction was confusion. Oppenheim wasn't where American forces were supposed to cross. There had been no artillery preparation, no aerial bombardment, no signs of the massive logistical buildup that major river crossings required. Either the reports were wrong, or something unprecedented was occurring. Within hours, additional reports confirmed the crossing was real and expanding rapidly. American forces were establishing a bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank without encountering the kind of resistance German defensive planning had assumed would occur. The forces at Oppenheim were weak, exhausted remnants of divisions shattered during the Saar-Palatinate campaign. They lacked the strength to mount effective counterattacks, and German reserves that might have reinforced them were positioned elsewhere, committed to defending against Montgomery's expected operation or covering other threatened sectors. The strategic implications hit German planners with devastating clarity. If Patton could cross the Rhine with minimal preparation and succeed, it meant German defensive capacity had deteriorated beyond the point where even natural barriers could be held. The Rhine was supposed to buy time. Instead, it had been breached in a single night by forces that shouldn't have been able to cross that quickly. When German commanders requested permission to counterattack the Oppenheim bridgehead, The response from higher command revealed the true depth of Germany's crisis. There were no reserves available. The admission was devastating because it acknowledged a reality that military operations depend upon. Armies need depth, forces held back to respond to unexpected developments, to exploit opportunities, to prevent breakthroughs from becoming catastrophes. By March 1945, the Wehrmacht no longer possessed operational reserves in any meaningful sense. Every division was committed. Every unit was engaged. There was nothing held back for contingencies, because there was nothing left to hold back. Years of warfare on multiple fronts had consumed Germany's military manpower. The failed Ardennes offensive in December had expended Germany's last assembled striking force without achieving strategic objectives. What remained were scattered units at various states of combat effectiveness, all desperately trying to slow Allied advances that seemed unstoppable. The specific request to attack the Oppenheim bridgehead illustrated this problem perfectly. German tactical doctrine emphasized immediate counterattacks against enemy penetrations before they could be reinforced and expanded. Speed was essential. Attack within hours, not days, using whatever forces could be assembled. But when field commanders asked what forces they should use for this counterattack, higher headquarters had no answer. The units nearest to Oppenheim were already engaged. The formations that might have been used were committed elsewhere or too depleted to conduct effective offensive operations. This paralysis extended beyond immediate tactical response. Even if German commanders had possessed reserves to counterattack at Oppenheim, larger strategic questions had no good answers. Montgomery's operation was scheduled to begin that same night. Should reserves be used against Patton's bridgehead or positioned to oppose Montgomery? If committed against one crossing, they wouldn't be available against the other. And with Remagen already providing First Army a crossing site to the north, German forces faced multiple Allied penetrations simultaneously. Exactly the kind of strategic situation that required depth and flexibility Germany no longer possessed. The command structure itself was breaking down under these pressures. Orders from Berlin often bore no relationship to battlefield reality. Demands to hold every position, conduct counterattacks with forces that didn't exist, and prevent Allied advances that had already occurred, created situations where field commanders faced impossible choices. Obey orders that made no military sense, or exercise initiative that might be labeled defeatism and result in removal or worse. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had taken command of German forces in the West, understood the situation with brutal clarity. He later described trying to command German armies in this period as attempting to play a Beethoven symphony on a broken, out-of-tune piano. The organizational structure existed, corps, divisions, regiments, but the actual combat power those formations possessed bore little resemblance to what their designations suggested. A division might consist of a few thousand exhausted soldiers rather than the 15,000 it was supposed to have. Equipment shortages meant units lacked vehicles, heavy weapons, or ammunition adequate for sustained operations. The fuel situation was particularly catastrophic. German forces that might have conducted mobile operations to respond to Allied crossings lacked the gasoline to move. Tanks sat immobilized. Truck convoys that might have repositioned reserves couldn't be assembled because there was no fuel to drive them. This created a vicious cycle. German forces couldn't respond quickly to Allied breakthroughs because they lacked mobility, which meant Allied forces exploited breakthroughs before German defenses could organize, which created more crises requiring mobile response that German forces couldn't provide. When Patton's forces crossed at Oppenheim, German commanders watching this development recognized it as confirmation of what many had privately concluded weeks earlier. The war was lost. Not lost in the sense that eventual defeat was likely, lost in the sense that Germany no longer possessed the military capacity to prevent that defeat, regardless of how determinedly soldiers fought. The Rhine had been breached. No reserves existed to counterattack, and more Allied crossings would follow because German forces lacked the strength to prevent them. German military planning in March 1945 had become an exercise in managing inevitable defeat rather than organizing coherent defense. Staff officers at OKW and Army Group headquarters still produced situation maps, compiled intelligence summaries, and drafted operational orders. But increasingly, these activities served bureaucratic and psychological purposes rather than military necessity. Planning gave the appearance of control over a situation that had long since spiraled beyond anyone's ability to manage. The contrast between planned operations and actual capabilities revealed this gap starkly. Defensive plans called for layered positions, where forward units would delay Allied advances, while reserves prepared counterattacks to contain breakthroughs. Reality was scattered units fighting isolated actions with no reserves to call upon, and no coordination beyond what local commanders could improvise. Plans assumed adequate supplies, functioning communications, and units at reasonable strength. Reality was chronic shortages, disrupted command networks, and formations reduced to fractions of authorized manning. Patton's Rhine crossing exemplified how completely Allied operational tempo had exceeded German capacity to respond through planning. By the time German intelligence confirmed the crossing, assessed its scale, transmitted reports to higher headquarters, and developed response plans, American forces had already expanded their bridgehead beyond what those plans addressed. The intelligence planning execution cycle that had served German forces well earlier in the war now operated too slowly to matter. Planning couldn't keep pace with events. This created profound frustration among German staff officers who understood that their professional expertise had become largely irrelevant. They could analyze Allied intentions correctly, identify optimal defensive positions, and develop tactically sound plans, but none of it mattered if forces to execute those plans didn't exist or couldn't reach positions in time. One German planner later described the experience as watching a chess game where every piece had been captured except the king, and being asked to develop a strategy for victory. The planning around Rhine defenses illustrated this particularly well. Months of staff work had identified defensive positions, calculated required force levels, planned logistics to sustain operations, and developed contingencies for various Allied crossing scenarios. All this careful planning was rendered meaningless when Patton crossed at an unexpected location without the extensive preparation German planners had assumed would precede any major Rhine assault. The planning had been professional and thorough. It just didn't account for an enemy who could improvise faster than German planning could adapt. German commanders also confronted the uncomfortable reality that American planning and execution had surpassed Wehrmacht capabilities in ways that earlier German confidence hadn't anticipated. The 1940 Blitzkrieg through France had established German military planning as the standard against which others were measured. But by 1945, American forces were conducting operations of comparable complexity while enjoying overwhelming material superiority. Patton's Rhine crossing demonstrated this: rapid staff work, flexible logistics, and aggressive execution that achieved strategic objectives through speed rather than careful preparation. The psychological impact on German planners was significant. Professional military officers took pride in their competence, their mastery of operational art, their ability to accomplish difficult missions through superior planning. Having that professional identity challenged, being out-planned and outfought by forces they had once considered amateur, created cognitive dissonance that some never fully resolved. Post-war accounts reveal continuing tension between acknowledging Allied operational skill and maintaining belief in German military superiority. By late March, German planning at OKW level had largely abandoned pretense of organizing coherent defense. Orders still went out, but they reflected desperation rather than strategy. Hold all positions, counterattack all penetrations, prevent all Allied advances. The orders were militarily meaningless because they demanded what was physically impossible, but they served political purposes, demonstrating that leadership was still issuing commands, maintaining fiction that organized resistance continued, even as everyone involved understood Germany was collapsing. In the days following Patton's Rhine crossing, German military communications revealed a disconnect between official assessments and private acknowledgments. Publicly, reports emphasized continued resistance, successful defensive actions, and determination to hold remaining positions. Privately, commanders and staff officers acknowledged to each other what couldn't be said officially. The war was over, Germany had lost, and continued fighting simply prolonged inevitable defeat while accumulating casualties that served no strategic purpose. This gap between public statement and private understanding created impossible situations throughout German command structure. Field commanders who recognized their situations were hopeless couldn't say so officially without risking removal for defeatism. Staff officers who calculated that defensive operations would fail couldn't present those assessments to superiors who insisted on optimistic projections. Intelligence analysts who reported overwhelming Allied superiority were sometimes accused of undermining morale, rather than accurately assessing battlefield realities. The Rhine crossings forced this issue because they provided undeniable evidence that Germany could no longer defend even major river barriers. Montgomery's Operation Plunder began on March 23rd with massive artillery preparation and airborne assaults. Despite this preparation giving German defenders advance warning, the operation succeeded with acceptable Allied casualties. If a methodically prepared crossing succeeded, and an improvised crossing at Oppenheim succeeded, it meant German defensive capacity was insufficient regardless of Allied approach. German propaganda tried to maintain narratives about continued resistance and possible counteroffensives, but these messages increasingly failed to convince anyone, including German soldiers and civilians. Soldiers fighting in isolated pockets could see they were surrounded with no relief coming. Civilians in cities facing Allied advances understood that promises of miracle weapons and final victories were fantasies. The gap between propaganda and reality had grown too wide to bridge. Some German commanders attempted to negotiate local surrenders or arrange withdrawals that would spare their troops and nearby civilians unnecessary casualties. These efforts were dangerous because higher authorities might interpret them as defeatism or treason. Officers who proposed surrendering surrounded garrisons, risked being relieved of command or worse. Yet continuing to fight in hopeless situations meant watching soldiers die for no strategic benefit. The admission that nobody in German high command would make officially, but that everyone involved understood privately, was that continuing the war served no German national interest. Every day of fighting meant more German soldiers and civilians died, more cities were destroyed, more territory was occupied by Allied forces who would control post-war Germany's fate. Surrendering immediately would save lives and infrastructure, but military and political leaders couldn't acknowledge this publicly without admitting that years of sacrifice had been for a cause now revealed as futile. This created a situation where German forces continued fighting not because they expected to win, but because the command structure couldn't admit defeat. Individual soldiers and small units surrendered when opportunities presented themselves. Larger formations fought when ordered, then withdrew or dissolved when situations became untenable. But organized, coordinated surrender of significant forces required authority that field commanders didn't possess and political leaders wouldn't exercise. The Rhine crossings became the symbolic moment when this truth became unavoidable. Germany's last major natural defensive barrier had been breached at multiple points within days. No subsequent defensive line could be held if the Rhine couldn't be held. The road into Germany's heartland lay open. Allied forces would advance until they met Soviet forces advancing from the east. The only questions remaining were how long the collapse would take, and how many more would die before it was complete. In the final weeks of the war, as Allied forces advanced across Germany, German military professionals engaged in assessments and calculations they couldn't share officially. These private evaluations, later revealed through diaries, post-war interviews, and captured documents, show a command structure that understood Germany's situation far better than official communications suggested, but lacked ability or authority to act on that understanding. The assessment of Patton's Rhine crossing and its strategic implications was remarkably consistent among German officers who analyzed it professionally. Third Army's success demonstrated that American operational capabilities had reached or exceeded Wehrmacht standards while enjoying material superiority that made German resistance increasingly futile. This was an uncomfortable conclusion for military professionals who had built careers on belief in German tactical and operational excellence. But the evidence was overwhelming. What particularly impressed German analysts was not the Rhine crossing itself, but the rapidity with which Third Army had exploited it. Within 48 hours of the initial crossing, 4 American divisions had crossed at Oppenheim and positioned themselves to advance into Germany. Third Army conducted 3 additional Rhine crossings at Boppard, St. Gore, and south of Mainz in quick succession, demonstrating that the initial success wasn't anomalous but represented systematic capability. This operational tempo couldn't be matched by German forces operating with fuel shortages, equipment deficits, and exhausted personnel. German military planners also recognized, though couldn't say officially, that the Rhine crossings had strategic implications beyond immediate tactical results. With Allied forces across the Rhine at multiple points, the Ruhr industrial region could be encircled, depriving Germany of manufacturing capacity essential to continued resistance. Southern Germany would be vulnerable to occupation. The link-up between Western and Soviet forces was inevitable, completing Germany's encirclement. No realistic operational plan existed that could prevent these outcomes. The post-war German military assessment of American commanders, compiled from interviews and captured documents, revealed professional respect for Patton's operational methods combined with acknowledgement that his approach represented effective application of mobile warfare principles German forces had pioneered, but American forces now executed with superior resources. Some German officers later upgraded their views of Patton, which historians attribute partly to cooling of wartime passions and partly to post-war political considerations when Germany joined NATO. But the core assessment remained consistent. Patton understood operational warfare, as well as any German commander, and applied those principles with advantages in material resources that Wehrmacht forces lacked. What German war planners realized when Patton crossed the Rhine overnight was ultimately a confirmation of what many had understood for months, but couldn't acknowledge officially. Germany had lost the war, further resistance was futile, and the rational response would be immediate surrender to minimize additional casualties and destruction. That this realization couldn't be acted upon revealed the dysfunction of a command system where political ideology prevented military professionals from making rational strategic decisions. The historical legacy of German planning's failure during the Rhine crossings is mixed. German tactical proficiency remained high throughout the war. Individual units often fought skillfully, even in hopeless situations. But operational and strategic planning became progressively less relevant as Germany's material situation deteriorated and leadership refused to acknowledge realities that planning couldn't overcome. The Rhine crossings were the moment when this disconnect between planning and reality became too obvious to ignore. What they couldn't say officially but acknowledged privately was simple. The Rhine should have held. It didn't hold because Germany lacked the military capacity to defend it. And if Germany couldn't hold its most formidable natural barrier, nothing that followed would change the inevitable outcome. Patton crossing overnight wasn't just a tactical setback. It was confirmation that the war German planners had spent years fighting was already over. They just hadn't been allowed to admit it yet.